So we're off to a great start, folks. Thank you so much. Keeping it moving, I am so thrilled to introduce our keynote speaker this morning. And many of you know him. Many of you know him. He's a product of Rochester. We're so proud of him. But we also look to his intellect and his scholarship. With no further ado, I bring you Simeon Banister from the Greater Rochester Health Foundation. Of course not. Maybe that's next. From RACF. Simeon, take it away, brother.
Thank you so much, Jerome. It is really a pleasure to be here with you. And as I was kind of scanning the few hundred folks that are participating in the chat, I must confess that this certainly feels like a family reunion of sorts. And we need these moments to connect with one another and to rejuvenate each other, to re-inspire each other, and to take these moments to recommit. And so we're so excited to be here. I must tell you that I've got two wonderful kids, Julian and Olivia. Julian's 8, Olivia is 4. Julian's gonna be 9 next week. And I always kind of said to myself that as a parent, I would try to kind of stay up on the kind of current trends, the contemporary things that were happening with dances and now memes. And I must confess that I have failed miserably, but there is one meme that I did pick up on and not too long ago. It was this idea that you have to understand the assignment. And so today, Jerome, I can tell you that I think I understand the assignment. Jerome asked me if I would talk with this august group about what an inclusive and equitable recovery means in Rochester, about how many of us have come together under the banner of the North Star Coalition as one vehicle amongst many to drive for an equitable recovery. And to talk a bit about this new concept, something we're going to introduce into Rochester's lexicon, this idea of greenlining. And so that is my charge for today. I believe I understand the assignment, and why don't we go on ahead and jump right in. Hopefully, if you can see the screen, I'll just ask Sarah if you can give me a oh yeah. And
oh yeah.
Oh yeah, all right, we're in good shape. Terrific. I want to start this morning in a place that is frankly a challenging place, difficult part of our history, but unnecessary. When I want to tell you first the story of Margaret Ward. This story comes from a book by a man named Ebert Petty. It's entitled Sketches in the History of the Underground Railroad. Margaret Ward and her infant son, Samuel Ringgold Ward, were enslaved in Maryland on the Eastern Shore. When she was 18 years old, the text describes her as a large woman, tall and well-formed. Her complexion, black as jet, her countenance, always pleasant, though she seldom laughed. At 20 years old, she was married. And again, the text implies that it was to someone that she really loved, but it was not long after her marriage that her young master became angry with her for what he called her stubbornness and resistance to his will. He threatened to chastise her by whipping, and in case the euphemism there is unclear, we were talking about rape. Well, as I mentioned, she was a large and strong woman, and he backed off the threat to whip her when she assured him that any attempt to execute his threat would surely result in the death of one of them. And so instead, he retaliated by selling her husband to the New Orleans slave market. He then put her in the hands of a brutal overseer with directions to work her until she couldn't stand. When her child was born, She was given less than a week to recover and nurse until she was, quote, driven again to the field. She couldn't even leave her child in the nursery that had been set up for enslaved children. Instead, she was told to leave her child under the shade of a bush in the field, and that she could only see the child twice during her brutally long days. On returning to the child one evening, she found him senseless and exhausted from crying. Although she felt that it would have been better for both herself and her child if they had both died, her mother's heart impelled her to make a move to save him. And by caressing him and carefully handling him, she resuscitated him. It was at this point that Margaret Ward decided to escape. I want to tell you about Samuel Green Jr. Samuel Green Jr.'s father, Samuel Sr., was a self-emancipated anti-slavery activist that worked with Harriet Tubman as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. His father's enslaver, Henry Nichols, stated in his last will and testament, "It is my will and desire that my Negro man, Sam Green, be sold for a term of 5 years, and my Negro man, Daniel, for a term of 10 years, and to have the liberty to choose masters, and the expiration of said terms, I do hereby manumit and set them free." In fact, over the next year, Sam Green's father earned enough money to pay off his remaining 4 years of service. And in 1842, he was able to purchase his wife, Kitty, for $100 from the enslaver, Ezekiel Richardson. Despite his best efforts to free their children, and by the way, he had sufficient money, their 2 children, Sam Jr. and Susan, were subsequently sold by Richardson to Dr. James Muse in 1847. Though he should have already been free, Samuel Jr., who had become a skilled blacksmith, decided that it was time to escape from Dr. Muse after learning that he was going to be sold to a Southern plantation. And finally, Frederick Douglass. And of course, we all know, arguably our most distinguished citizen. Born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, he started his life enslaved also on the Eastern Shore. After separation from his mother during infancy, young Frederick lived with his family and rarely met his mother before her death. Now, you can take the time to read his harrowing biography across his 3 autobiographical works, but there's one story in particular that stood out to me. In 1826, Douglass was sent to the service of Hugh Auld in Baltimore. By 1838, he was being hired to work in the docks repairing ships, and he earned wages for that work, but those wages were stolen by Auld. In fact, Douglass, the capable man that he was, negotiates to at least receive a portion of those wages. But by this time, Douglass has already freed his mind, having expanded his literacy. And not long after, he decides to free his body and escape. As I recount these stories, as I think about these narratives, they strike me as all too familiar. Struggling through the evil and darkness of chattel slavery, a mother sees her children in danger. The son of a freedman is denied the promise of freedom and self-determination and access to the benefits of that freedom by the capricious whims of institutions that have interests that run counter to his own. And finally, wage theft and exploitation of labor, the commodification of fellow human beings, evidenced in Frederick Douglass's story. I suppose this narrative sounds so familiar because in report after report and in analysis after analysis, we continue to hear the same narratives. Too many of our children live in danger. Over 70 youth were murdered in 2021, the highest number in a decade, record-breaking in all the wrong ways. The Common Ground Color of Health report shares with us that Black residents are 3 times as likely to have an infant die in their first year of life. Barriers to care from the Children's Agenda indicates that children enrolled in childcare have taken a nosedive, and it's been exacerbated by the pandemic. This sounds all too familiar because the language of freedom and determination feels purely rhetorical, that all too often your zip code leaves you vulnerable to a life devoid of true opportunity. The Hard Facts report illustrates to us the disparities that continue to persist in economic growth and economic opportunity, everything from the median income to the levels of home ownership. Regardless of your talent and your skills, where you live, your background, your race has become determinant for your ultimate outcomes in life. And that theme of worker exploitation, the labor disparities, where in our community, worker age Black and Hispanic residents are nearly 50% less likely to be employed than white residents. Over 40% of Black and Hispanic residents earn less than the area median income in our region. The employment rate in the bottom 5th of our region's neighborhoods was 49%. The employment rate was 82% in the top 20%. We know that wage theft, particularly from a report from the Department of Tax and Finance, remains rampant, particularly in cash-based businesses, and that's been exacerbated all the more because of the pandemic. Consider with me, my friends, that the challenges that beset these 3 folks in the midnight of slavery, over 200 years ago, the same themes continue to show up even today. But there's a part of the story for each of these heroes that stands squarely among the best of us in the American tradition. In their darkest moments, in their deepest despair, they looked to the North Star. The North Star, which had led generations of sailors and travelers to their destination. It was the North Star which oriented them in a disorienting land. It was the North Star on which they marked their progress towards their goals. It was ultimately through the North Star where they were able to find safety and the grounds on which to fight for justice and equality. And it's from this impulse, this thrust, this reference point that the North Star Coalition was born. That the challenges that we confront are neither fixed nor ordained by the laws of the universe, but they can be changed. They can be confronted, they can be affected through the agency that we can all exercise together. The North Star Coalition is embraced as the North Star, that together we can harness the opportunity of this federal stimulus, of this moment for recovery, to significantly improve the lives of historically marginalized populations, to create shared economic prosperity in our region. Let's take a moment to unpack that. First, I want to look back again at some of the connective tissue that gets us to where we are today and why we think that stimulus really matters. If I can give you a little additional context, a lot of times for those that have kind of heard me talk in the past about some of these historic issues and to kind of offer this kind of context, I've often talked about my dad's family here in Rochester. But today I want to take a little different tack. I want to tell you a little bit about my mom's family. And some of the folks that are listening in today, no doubt, know my mom as an educator. But what you probably don't know about her is that she's from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. And the gentleman that you see in the photo on the screen is my great-great-grandfather, Iris Sulcer. He shared the same name as my mother, William Iris Sulcer. And William Sulcer lived to be 105 years old and was really a prolific man in Oklahoma history. He was a Sooner and he made his way there, was one of the founders of Langston University because he too was an educator like my mother. It kind of runs in the family, I suppose, in some ways. William Sulcer, this prolific individual, also had the distinction of serving on the Oklahoma Colored Democratic Association. And when he was serving on that association, he received at one point this pamphlet. This was amidst a series of letters and documents that he had saved for his future generations. This particular pamphlet, as you see on the right, was called 1,000 Reasons Why Negroes Should Vote for the Re-Election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I want to point to two things that were particularly interesting in this pamphlet. First, FDR noted that today the Negroes of America have in the White House a man who can see, quote, even the sparrows in our national life, a bit paternalistic. The general attitude of the president has been so humanitarian, so full of integrity and fair play, that American Negroes can well afford to pin their faith in 4 more years of, quote, the New Deal. What was this New Deal? Well, one example of the New Deal was its work in housing policy. The government had expended more than $100 million in clearing up, and listen to this language, slums and large urban centers and erecting clean, wholesome buildings for Negro occupancy. The beautiful Ida B. Wells Halogen project in Chicago has just been completed and is representative of similar projects erected across cities across the country. If you're familiar with Chicago and know Chicago history, then the Ida B. Wells complex, ultimately becomes just what the word suggests, the projects. It's important to really contextualize history because we don't want to take our modern lens and obliterate some of the contributions that were made. Certainly, we would acknowledge that the New Deal represented some degree of progress for the country and for the country's African-American population. However, we also have to recognize some of the key challenges because of the zeitgeist, the context of the time. I have to believe that regardless of the time, racism and bias was always wrong. The New Deal operated primarily through federal action versus state and local action. And that's an important distinction that shows up in the recovery today. And we'll cover that momentarily. But put that in your back pocket. That's an important point to know. Federal action versus some of the state and local action. The New Deal was intended to respond to changing economic circumstances. There had been a global pandemic. There had been economic decline because of the Great Depression and the crash and Black Tuesday. And so the legislation attempted to really stimulate the economy, though some folks argue that it didn't go far enough. It certainly laid the groundwork so that by the time the war economy rolled around in the early 40s, the country was economically on its way, and it created significant benefits that fundamentally transformed the country. In some cases, though, the policies of the New Deal were racially neutral, but they did not include racial protections. Again, keep that theme in mind, put that in your pocket. Policies that were racially neutral, but they were not considerate of the disparities that had been created because of the history that we heard with Margaret Ward and Sam Green and Frederick Douglass. And so what we end up with is a series of pieces of legislation. Some of these you know well. Perhaps you've heard about the exclusion in Social Security. Perhaps you've heard about the later the GI Bill and the exclusionary practices. But there were other pieces of the legislation I just want to highlight just for your attention. Things like the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which unfortunately was written in a way that theoretically was beneficial for folks that were people of color, except that it was racially neutral, it was racially benign, but it didn't take into account the fact that Black people could not own land. They were tenants and they were sharecroppers, and subsequently did not benefit from the Adjustment Act, which set a 1/9 share of the benefits of said act, the dollars that were distributed, to go to tenants and sharecroppers. And even in those cases, those dollars rarely made it to those tenants and sharecroppers because they were exploited. The Fair Labor Standards Act is another piece of legislation that established the minimum wage. This was a significant step forward for many residents and citizens in the country, except for the fact that jobs were made scarce by upward pressure on wages. Racism became easier to indulge. And when it came time to ask the question, who was going to be laid off or let go after the implementation of the act, we know that it was largely Black workers that were dismissed. Some of the parts of the New Deal that maybe we're not as familiar with. One part that I know that we're familiar with, though, at this point, is the creation of the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the story of redlining. And by now, nearly everyone on this call knows the red line map of Rochester, knows that there's a direct overlay between the areas that were redlined and many of the disparities that we described earlier. We know that mortality vis-a-vis what the Color of Health report shares with us for Black residents, 67% higher premature mortality for African Americans in Rochester and the Finger Lakes region. And that is directly connected to many of the areas that you see colored in red on this map. So this is a story that many of us by now are all too familiar with. So that then begs the question for us, and this is where I share with you the gospel, the good news, is that this doesn't have to be our story, that we can do something different. In fact, there's a report that came out from the Urban Institute that begged the question of inclusive recovery. And what the report demonstrates is that cities that have embraced, regions that have embraced a series of practices that are oriented towards economic inclusion and racial inclusion are seeing tremendous growth. Right now, Rochester ranked 241st out of the 274 cities that were studied, but we can do better than that. The ground is being laid right now for us to make the change and to change our trajectory. Consider the chart from the Brookings Metro Monitor, which demonstrates here that if we think about the economy as a function, at least in part, of productivity, I want you to focus in where it says change in gross metropolitan product, 9.4% growth. We are 49th out of 53 cities that were measured. Oh man, that is pretty terrible over this 10-year period from 2009 to 2019. Consider that number. That represents, by the way, about $57 billion of gross municipal activity over that period. And if you think even more closely about productivity, we can see that from the Metro Monitor, in addition to the gross metropolitan product, that output per job, while it is increased, it started to decrease and certainly lags behind the United States and other comparable regions. But new research shows that we may have at least part of the explanation. There's a report called The Economic Gains from Equity from the Brookings Institute. And this is one of the most exciting pieces of research that I've certainly come across in the recent history. Came out in September of 2021. It was originally actually published by the San Francisco Fred. What they pointed out is that the persistence of systemic disparities is costly, and eliminating them has the potential to produce large economic gains. And here's the basic premise here, and this is the thing that's so fascinating to me. They didn't take the classical economist model and attribute this to labor utilization rates and educational attainment levels to explain the disparity. No, what they started with is the basic presumption that talent and the preference to work is equitably distributed, that whether you are Black or white or Latinx or whatever your persuasion, whatever your background, that you can find talent if you look everywhere, that you can find the desire and preference to contribute economically everywhere. So unless you're a bell curve person, I know you have to believe this. And so therefore, if we are not maximizing that talent, that represents economic loss. But the flip side of that, of course, is that we can maximize that talent. We can invest in communities that have been on the economic margins. Consider that the report shows us that inequity has cost us $0.76 trillion each year, almost $22.9 trillion over the 30-year period of the study. Talked to the author of the report about running some calculations for us. And I said, if I just did this back of napkin calculation, does this work at least to get us at least a sense of what our potential economic gains could be in our community? And they said, okay, it's a reasonable way. They're going to do some additional research for us. But if we assume a proportional regional share of the $0.76 trillion a year, so basically if we said, what is the GDP? And we divided our regional contribution, our MSA's contribution to that GDP, we are about 364ths of the US economy. And if you take that 364ths, that represents about $2 billion of the $0.76 trillion that we've lost. Over the 10-year period of the study, that would represent about $20.9 billion of economic loss, or the potential for economic growth as a result of embracing equity, of investing in communities that have been marginalized. That would take us from the $57-ish billion to $77.6 billion. We would go from being ranked 49th in the country to being ranked 6th in the country behind Raleigh and Cary, North Carolina. The opportunity is there for us. An inclusive and equitable recovery can unlock economic growth for our region. And that's a reason to get excited. So how does this coalition work? Well, the coalition basically identifies 3 buckets that the stimulus is being distributed. We've got direct stimulus, like the child care tax credit, the supports that went to families. Incidentally, we have a fascinating research study now about how direct stimulus does work, that the Keynesian principles and some of the underlying thought around getting money directly into the hands, particularly of folks that have been marginalized, actually produces better economic outcomes for those families. What can the coalition do? We can make sure that every single person in this community gets access to that which they are eligible, that people know about and understand the methodologies to receive those dollars. We've got to get the word out, and we can bang the cymbals. And the coalition has brought on a firm leading with our values. Guy Paul Hippolyte and his team are helping us to do that work and to treat this like a campaign. The same way that we get our elected officials, folks know about them and hear about them and their policies, we want folks to hear about this inclusive and equitable recovery. There's money that's been distributed directly to states and municipalities. And this is largely, when we talk about stimulus in the public discourse, really where we focus. The $144 million that's gone to the county, the $202 million to the city, the over $200 million to the school district. That's just in ARPA, not including the CARES Act and the CRSA dollars that were distributed. Instead of issuing invectives or polemics and telling people what they have to do, the coalition says, let's provide analysis, data, key insights. Let's connect with the resources that we need so we can make the smartest choices about how to realize this North Star of getting dollars into the hands of people that have been historically marginalized. Let's think about the smart policies, the smart choices, the things that are happening all across the community. And we're excited that the coalition is broadening, that all of our local elected officials have signed on board from our state delegation and our federal officials. We're excited that labor has joined, that the education partners have joined, that we are establishing a broad coalition that includes everyday people, so that we have both content experts, but also context experts. Final bucket is aid that can go directly to organizations. And we're discovering a methodology to provide grant and application support directly to organizations to ensure that CDFIs and others get their fair share. It is absolutely critical that we get this right. We got to get this right, friends, because getting it right means changing the trajectory of our community, making sure that we get every dollar that we can. Imagine with me back in 2009 with the ARRA. At the time I was working in state government, and I recall vividly being up trying to figure out what a shovel-ready project was. Communities like ours sent a lot of money back to the federal government that we didn't use that could have made a difference. Consider this. In 2009, if we had been able to invest in the shovel-ready project of expanding broadband, what would that have meant in 2020 when we were spending millions of dollars to get kids MiFis and Chromebooks and other technology as a patch? Let's not make the same mistake. Finally, to make sure that I fully understood the assignment, I need to talk to you very quickly about greenlining, and then we're going to end and shift to hear from some of the leaders in our community's financial sector. Greenlining. Talk about a positive statement. The folks over at Pastone have introduced us to the case made work, which causes us to really lift up the idea that we've got to be positive and about the ways that we talk about the solutions and remedies for our community. We've certainly had our share of the bad news, even this morning, but what's the good news? Well, the good news is that we can introduce greenlining into Rochester's lexicon. So what is greenlining? Greenlining is the affirmative and proactive practice of providing economic opportunities directly into communities of color, those that have been historically marginalized. Greenlining gives us a chance to reconceive of the model of our economy, a redlined economy that's dependent on the exercise of power, that demonstrates clear racism is only profit-driven, that uses as its methods segregatory behavior, extraction of dollars, exclusion of people, hyper-productivity that all of us end up suffering, hyper-individualism that undermines our ability to collaborate and work together, and ultimately results in the persistence of white supremacy and the persistence of income inequality and the degradation of our climate and the concentration of power and wealth that is undermining the quality of life, literally, for all of us. A green-lined economy says, let's put the community at the center. Let's come up with practices that are regenerative, that restore our economy, that are democratic, that encourage us to cooperate, that are inclusive, that are not exploitative, that depend on making equity real, that shares power, that centers communities of color, and that have it as its outcomes, racial justice, shared prosperity, and resilient ecosystems. The Greenlining Institute, which is a real resource, certainly for this presentation, and one that I would encourage you to check out, greenlining.org, offers what I think are really interesting standards for equitable community investment as a way to get us to the point where we can actually bring this to fruition, this greenlined economy. But in the spirit of the idea that there is nothing new under the sun, when I've reflected on the standards for their community investment, I found myself going back to the original article, the first article that Frederick Douglass penned in the North Star paper. And in that article, he described a number of these concepts. If you think about it, he said, for example, that if we need to emphasize race-conscious solutions and deliver intentional benefits, Frederick Douglass's words, it is neither a reflection on the fidelity nor a disparagement of the ability of our friends and fellow laborers to assert what common sense affirms and only folly denies, that the man who has suffered the wrong is the man to demand redress, that the man struck is the man to cry out, and that he who has endured the cruel pangs of slavery is the man to advocate liberty. Race-conscious policies like redlining and urban renewal demand that we are conscious about race as we make our decisions, that race-neutral policies can't fix the underlying inequities. Think about what we learned earlier. Investment has to prioritize and target folks that are in the most vulnerable communities. And that even as benefits are distributed, we have to appreciate that they don't trickle down, that they have to go directly to the people in the most impactful ways while avoiding increasing new burdens in those communities. Prioritizing multi-sector approaches. Douglass says, in the grand struggle for liberty and equality now waging, it is meet, right, and essential that there should be a rise in our ranks, authors and editors, as well as orators, for in these capacities, the most permanent good can be rendered to our cause. He is arguing that there are different modalities that we need to be operating on, including the authors and editors and writing. He certainly had a sophisticated view that appreciated that programs might be siloed, but problems are not, and that we have to prioritize approaches that address multiple issues and multiple sectors at the same time. Douglass said, we have pursued our object till on the threshold of attaining it, our press and printing materials are bought and paid for. Our office is secured and well situated in the center of business in this enterprising city. He certainly was aware of the need to establish paths towards wealth building, that the paper was not merely a nonprofit exercise, but in his case, it was a business. We need community ownership of assets and opportunities to continue to build wealth in a broad fashion in our community, because the income disparities that are existing are undermining our growth. For those that don't know, the Gini coefficient is one metric of income inequality. New York State has amongst the highest states in the country in terms of our Gini coefficient. Rochester is right up there at the top of the list. So in one of the most income unequal countries, and in the state with the highest level of income inequality, we live in a city and a region that struggles with those same challenges. We've got to do this differently. We've got to establish paths that create community ownership of assets so that as many people as possible can participate in wealth building, can participate in home ownership, can participate in generational wealth transfer. Finally, we've got to be community driven at every stage, and we've got to build community capacity. Again, Douglass's words, it's long been our anxious wish to see in this slave-holding, slave-trading, Negro-hating land of printing press and paper permanently established under the complete control and direction of the immediate victims of slavery and oppression. Hitherto, the immediate victims of slavery and prejudice, owing to various causes, have had little share in this department of effort. They have frequently undertaken and almost as frequently failed. And we are not wholly unaware of the duties, hardships, and responsibilities of our position. We have easily reimagined some, and friends have not hesitated to inform us of others. Many are doubtless yet to be revealed by that infallible teacher experience. A few of them solemnize, but do not appall us. We have counted the cost. Our mind is made up, and we are resolved to go forward. The investments that we make in our community, centering and empowering the community, and recognizing that we have to invest in our communities to build their capacity, that we can't simply hand over dollars and say, good luck, that our investment recognizes the long-term disinvestment and discriminatory practices that have eroded our community's capacity for leadership and organizing. And so smart policy requires us to lean in and to help the community grow. So when it's all said and done, all of these policies, all of these ideas, whether it's the green lining work or the realization of our North Star, is only possible if we make it happen. This morning, we've talked about some heady concepts, some broad structural issues, institutional and systemic facets, but at some point it comes down to empowering people. Linda Creed was the singer-songwriter that penned the lyrics for the Philadelphia soul sound. Hits like You Are Everything, Betcha by Golly Wow, The Rubber Band Man, and The Greatest Love of All. That somehow, at the age of just 23, this brilliant songwriter blessed us with a keen insight beyond her years. And one of my favorite songs, People Make the World Go Round, she says, but that's what makes the world go round, the ups and downs, the carousel. Changing people's heads around, go underground, young man. People make the world go round. People make policies. People make decisions. People make choices. And together we make the world go round. And with that, we're going to hear from some people. It's my pleasure to bring to the stage.
Simeon, before you bring them, Simeon, I want to interrupt because I'm going to, there are a couple questions I'm going to allow two, because as usual, you're so engaging, and I'm going to allow two. And this one from an anonymous attendee, which is interesting. I'll read it just as it sounds, and I'll give a little editorial because I got some feelings too. These are all community-based solutions, referring to what you've been talking about, which are helpful, but is there a place for personal responsibility? If individuals don't take advantage of these investments, then outcomes will not change. Can we have equal outcomes without equal effort? And my quick editorial before I let you go is to the anonymous attendee, is that been there, done that. And when I say been there, done that, despite people's efforts over and over and over again, we have what we have. It's literally a false narrative, to talk about personal responsibility of people who have been oppressed and continue to be oppressed. But we find that, and Simeon, myself, and Dan Burns and Dr. Kyler, we are on Evan Dawson's show, and the issue of backlash against equity came up, and it neglects the acknowledgement that harm has been done. So, Simeon, I'll yield for your comments on that, the issue where does personal responsibility come into the issue of equity.
Yeah, I'm not sure where the question came in the presentation, but Frederick Douglass kind of answered that question 162 years ago when he said, again, hitherto the immediate victims of slavery and prejudice, owing to various causes, have had little share in this department of effort. In fact, they have frequently undertaken and almost as frequently failed. They're aware of the duties, the hardships, and the responsibilities that must be taken. But the fact of the matter is that, as Frederick Douglass states, times are a little different now. We've counted the cost. The mind is made up, and our community is resolved to go forward. We have to recognize that the disparities that have been existent in our communities for so long, the exclusionary practices, the register of that, the way it shows up in the lives of folks, is that folks have barriers to climb because of trauma, barriers to climb because of the lack of opportunity and experience. And so then the opportunity, the responsibility here is not to castigate folks. If that's the way you feel about personal responsibility, then I'd love to see you lean in to engage folks to make sure that folks have the access and the opportunities. Plus, if we want to talk about personal responsibility in the same way that talent and preference is equitably distributed, my experience, so is responsibility. You were the leader of Enron, you were pretty personally irresponsible. And so we recognize that people have moral failings, people have challenges that they have to confront, but we also recognize that it is equally the case that folks are working hard, that they want a better life for themselves and their families, that we all share that as part of the human experience. And so folks have a way of rising to the occasion when the ground is made equal.
Thank you, and we'll take this last one, and then we'll move on to the August panel. And this one is from Lisa Reagan. She says, "Thank you, Simeon. Will inclusive, I think she means greenlining, include a focus on women as a historically disadvantaged population intersecting with race consciousness? Our senior women lost through exclusion from decades of Social Security and have lost jobs at a disproportionate disproportionate level from all men. Our women tend to be our community builders. I look forward to discussion of these issues.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And I think, there's an interesting concept. It's been floating around our community a little bit, and it's part of the lexicon in some ways, probably deserves a bit more of a prominent role. But this idea of targeted universalism, right? So what we've got to think through is how we are all making progress. And the one of the kind of ideas that's really been an imposition for community building and community progress is the notion that this is a zero-sum game. And frankly, that's just not how economy even works, right? Even in some ways in the classical sense, that momentum builds momentum. And so, yes, we need to focus on folks that have been historically marginalized, because that's where the opportunity and the promise is. And that includes and absolutely lifts up women. I mean, my goodness, do we need to be thoughtful about not just the concerns around pay equity and pay disparities, but also the way that lifestyle choices, the kind of traditional cultural choices that we have, the way that that plays out in the lives of women. I know that I personally, in our own home, we've really tried to kind of really be thoughtful about these, quote unquote, roles that we have to play to make sure that we've distributed our efforts in ways that are equitable, and certainly want to be a model for that for others.
All right, thanks. So again, there are a couple of other questions, but based on time, folks, we got to continue with the panel. Simeon, I'll let you get to that.